We are so deeply grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with us, listening to stories that breathe with the quiet heartbeat of another era. We hope you'll find something of yourself in these pages, something that resonates in the chambers of your own heart. Where are you watching from? Write it in the comments. We'd love to know which corner of the world has brought you here today. There was a woman in the village of Ashford Hollow who had perfected the art of vanishing while still remaining visible. A peculiar talent born not of magic, but of necessity. Eleanor Hartwell moved through the stone-paved lanes and hedgerow-bordered paths like a whisper made flesh. Her presence acknowledged yet somehow never quite registered in the consciousness of those who passed her by. She was 32 years of age, neither young enough to be pitied as a spinster nor old enough to be dismissed as settled into permanent solitude, existing instead in that peculiar limbo where society tends to forget a woman altogether. Her hair, the color of autumn chestnuts touched by morning frost, was always pinned with such precision that not a single strand dared rebel, as though even her appearance had learned the value of restraint. Her eyes, a shade of gray that shifted between storm clouds and morning mist depending on the light, held depths that no one ever thought to plumb, for to see deeply into another requires the belief that depth exists in the first place. The year was 1911, and England's countryside still clung to rhythms established long before, where everyone knew everyone's business yet somehow managed to know nothing of substance at all. The village existed in that golden afternoon of the Edwardian age, unaware that twilight was already gathering on distant horizons, that the world they knew would soon crack open like an egg revealing something entirely unrecognizable within. Eleanor lived in Rosewood Cottage, a modest dwelling inherited from an aunt who had possessed the good sense to die without heirs more deserving, and she tended her garden with the same meticulous silence she applied to all aspects of her existence. The roses she cultivated were the talk of the village during their brief season of glory, great blooming affairs in shades of cream and blush that seemed almost indecent in their lushness, as though all the passion Eleanor contained within herself had been channeled into those thorny stems and velvet petals. People spoke of her kindly enough when they spoke of her at all, noting her reliability at church, her neat appearance, her willingness to assist with charitable endeavors when asked, though never volunteering herself forward unbidden. She was, in the most complete sense, safe, a word that should have been a compliment but somehow never quite managed to be. What they did not see, what perhaps no one had seen in more than a decade, was the way her hands trembled when she had to speak in company, the way her throat closed, as though an invisible hand had wrapped itself around her neck, the way every word she considered uttering seemed to pass through some internal gauntlet where it was examined, weighed, and more often than not, found wanting. How does one explain to the world that speaking, that most natural of human acts, has become an act of such tremendous courage that silence seems the only rational choice? Who among us has not at some point swallowed words that burned all the way down, leaving scars in places no one else could see? The village found her quietness charming, in the way one finds a decorative object charming, pleasant enough to have about, requiring no particular attention or care. They did not know, could not have known, that her silence was not a choice but a fortress, constructed brick by careful brick in the aftermath of a humiliation so complete that it had fundamentally altered the architecture of her soul. But fortresses, however well constructed, require maintenance, and there are cracks that form in even the strongest walls when the pressure comes not from without, but from within. On the morning everything began to shift. Eleanor stood in her garden with dirt under her fingernails and a basket of cut roses at her feet, watching the lane where a moving wagon had just pulled up to the estate next door, and something in her chest tightened with a prescience she could not name but recognized nonetheless. Change was coming to Ashford Hollow, arriving with the sound of wheels on gravel and the shouts of men unloading furniture. And Eleanor Hartwell, who had spent more than 10 years learning to be invisible, was about to discover that some people possess the particular gift of seeing exactly what others have worked so hard to hide. The memory lived in Eleanor's body more than in her mind, residing in the muscles that tensed when she heard raised voices, in the heat that flooded her cheeks at unexpected attention, in the way her voice seemed to retreat deep into her chest whenever more than 3 people gathered in a room. She had been 20 years old, engaged to a gentleman of modest means but respectable family, standing in the assembly rooms at Whitmore during the midsummer ball with her intended's mother examining her as one might examine a horse at market. checking her teeth, so to speak, for signs of breeding and worth. The older woman's voice had carried across the room with the particular clarity that damning pronouncements always seemed to possess, declaring that while Eleanor was pretty enough in a common sort of way, her conversation was remarkably dull, and her opinions, when she dared voice them, revealed a mind utterly lacking in refinement. The engagement had dissolved within a fortnight, her intended having discovered that his affections were better placed with a young woman whose family connections could advance his prospects, and whose conversation, apparently, sparkled with the requisite brilliance. What followed was worse than the loss itself. It was the echoing, the way whispers multiplied and distorted, until Eleanor could no longer distinguish between what had actually been said and what had grown in the retelling. She became the cautionary tale mothers used with their daughters, the example of what happened when a woman of insufficient family and fortune attempted to rise above her station through an advantageous match. Her every word in company was now examined for evidence of the dullness that had been pronounced upon her, her every silence interpreted as proof of having nothing of value to contribute. The village had not been cruel exactly. Cruelty requires intention and energy. And what they had offered was something far more insidious. A kind of benevolent dismissal, a collective agreement that Eleanor was harmless and therefore negligible, worth neither their malice nor their genuine interest. Is there any wound that cuts deeper than being deemed fundamentally uninteresting, not even worth the effort of active dislike? She had withdrawn then, gradually, like a tide that recedes so slowly one doesn't notice until the shore lies exposed and barren. First, she stopped offering her thoughts in mixed company. Then she stopped attending gatherings where conversation was expected. And finally, she settled into the pattern that had defined the past 12 years. Present, but not participating. Seen, but not heard. Existing in the margins of village life with the dedication of a monk committed to vows of near silence. Her cottage became her hermitage. Her garden the only place where she allowed herself the luxury of creation, of bringing something beautiful into being without fear of judgment or dismissal. The roses didn't care if her observations were dull or her mind unrefined. They bloomed regardless, responding only to the attentiveness of her care and the quality of the soil she provided. Yet trauma has a curious way of settling into one's bones, of becoming so familiar that one forgets it isn't a natural part of one's constitution. Eleanor had carried her shame for so long that she had almost convinced herself it was wisdom, that her silence was discernment, that her withdrawal was dignity, that her fear was prudence. She had built her entire adult life around the principle of avoiding situations where she might once again be found wanting, and in doing so, had created a life so small and carefully contained that it required almost nothing of her except endurance. We tell ourselves such stories to survive, don't we? We call our cages by prettier names: sanctuary, wisdom, self-protection, until we almost believe that we built the walls ourselves by choice rather than necessity. But the human heart is a stubborn creature, refusing to be entirely silenced even when its owner has dedicated years to the effort. Eleanor still read voraciously, her mind ranging across literature and philosophy and history, even as her voice remained trapped behind the gates of her teeth. She still felt the full spectrum of human emotion: anger at injustice, joy at beauty, longing for connection, even as she presented to the world a face of placid acceptance. And sometimes, late at night, when the cottage settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, she would stand before her mirror and practice speaking, her voice rusty with disuse, testing words like a musician testing an instrument that had been too long in storage. What might have become of her if nothing had changed, if the new neighbor had never arrived to disrupt the careful equilibrium she had maintained? But change, as we know, respects no one's carefully constructed peace. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. Your support breathes life into these tales of quiet hearts and hidden courage. Colonel Edward Ashworth arrived at Thornfield Manor with the efficiency of a military campaign, transforming the long vacant estate from dust-shrouded monument to operational household within a matter of weeks. He was 45 years old, retired from active service after sustaining an injury that left him with a pronounced limp and a temperament apparently as damaged as his leg, known in the village within days for his exacting standards and his complete intolerance for what he termed nonsense, a category that seemed to encompass most forms of human warmth or spontaneity. His appearance suggested a man constructed from harder materials than most mortals, tall and broadly built despite the injury, with iron-gray hair cropped military short, eyes the color of winter ice, and a jaw that looked as though it had been chiseled from granite by a sculptor who believed firmly in straight lines and right angles. He moved through the world with the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, his very presence seeming to demand that reality conform itself to his expectations rather than the reverse. The village found him imposing and somewhat frightening, though they would have phrased it more diplomatically as impressive and commanding. Within his first month of residence, he had dismissed 3 servants for infractions that seemed to others minor at best, reorganized the entire structure of his household with the precision of a general deploying troops, and made it abundantly clear that he expected his privacy to be respected and his boundaries to remain inviolate. He attended church but sat in stony silence, contributing generously to charitable causes but refusing all social invitations, and walked his property each morning at precisely 6:30, regardless of weather, his great black dog at his heels, surveying his domain as though still commanding a regiment rather than merely a country estate. People whispered that the war had changed him, though in truth no one in Ashford Hollow had known him before, so they were really only guessing at what he might have been in comparison to what he had become. His property shared a boundary with Eleanor's cottage, separated by an old stone wall that ran the length of her garden and his southernmost grounds, and it was here that their first conflict arose. Eleanor's roses, those glorious creations that represented her sole act of defiance against a life of restraint, had over the years sent climbing tendrils over and through the wall, creating a cascade of blooms on both sides of the boundary. She had always thought of them as a gift to whoever might eventually occupy Thornfield, a softening of harsh stone with living beauty. But Colonel Ashworth apparently viewed them as an invasion, an unauthorized encroachment upon territory that was indisputably his. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Eleanor was trimming the roses when she heard the sharp crack of branches being broken, and looked up to find the colonel on the other side of the wall, systematically tearing down every tendril that had dared cross into his property, ripping them from the stone with a violence that seemed excessive for the removal of flowers. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to ask him please to stop, but the words caught in her throat like fish bones, sharp and immovable. Instead, she stood frozen, watching him destroy in minutes what had taken years to cultivate, her hands gripping her pruning shears so tightly that her knuckles went white. He glanced at her once, briefly, his expression utterly neutral, and then returned to his work as though she were no more significant than the roses themselves. Decorative, perhaps, but ultimately subject to his authority over his own domain. When he finished, he brushed the debris from his hands with businesslike efficiency and spoke his first words to her, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to issuing orders. She was to keep her plants on her side of the wall, as he had no intention of tolerating such disorder on his property. Then he turned and walked away, his limp barely slowing his departure, leaving Eleanor standing among the scattered petals and broken stems like a survivor surveying a battlefield. How does one respond to such casual destruction, such absolute dismissal of something one has nurtured with care and patience? Eleanor gathered the broken roses with shaking hands, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall, and carried them into her cottage, where she arranged them in every available vessel, determined that their beauty should not be entirely wasted, even if their life had been cut short. That night, lying in bed with moonlight painting silver patterns across her ceiling, she composed in her mind all the things she might have said, should have said, would have said if she were someone different, someone brave, someone whose voice had not been stolen by shame so many years ago. But morning came as it always did, and with it the familiar weight of silence settled once more across her shoulders, heavy as a yoke, familiar as her own skin. The second encounter came a week later, when Eleanor discovered that Colonel Ashworth had erected a new section of fence along a portion of the boundary where the old wall had crumbled, effectively blocking the small gap she had used for years to access the stream that ran through what had been common ground. The stream, technically on Thornfield property but traditionally accessible to the cottage residents for drawing water and washing, had been part of her daily routine for as long as she had lived there, and now she found herself faced with a locked gate and a neatly lettered sign, indicating that the property was private and trespassers would be prosecuted. The word struck her with almost physical force. Trespasser, after more than a decade of peaceful coexistence with the land, suddenly redefined as an intruder, an unwanted presence requiring prosecution. This time, Eleanor understood that silence would not suffice, that some response was required even if the very thought of confrontation made her feel as though her lungs had forgotten how to draw breath. She approached Thornfield's front entrance with the grim determination of a soldier advancing toward enemy fire. Her heart hammering so violently, she feared it might be visible through her dress, her carefully rehearsed words already beginning to fragment and scatter in her mind like startled birds. The housekeeper who answered the door regarded her with the particular blend of suspicion and dismissal reserved for the lower orders, but eventually admitted her to a drawing room of almost aggressively masculine decoration. Dark wood, leather furnishings, not a soft surface or bright color to be found anywhere, as though comfort itself might be considered a form of weakness. Colonel Ashworth kept her waiting for precisely 20 minutes, a span of time she spent perched on the edge of a chair that seemed designed to prevent relaxation, her prepared speech dissolving entirely as her anxiety mounted. When he finally appeared, he did not apologize for the delay or invite her to state her business, but simply stood near the fireplace with one hand resting on the mantel, looking at her with an expression of polite expectation that somehow managed to communicate profound impatience. Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice emerging thin and uncertain, explaining about the stream, the tradition, the fence, asking if perhaps some accommodation might be made, and with every word she could hear the dullness he must be hearing, the lack of sparkle or refinement that had been pronounced upon her all those years ago. Is there anything more exhausting than being forced to advocate for oneself when one has been taught that one's needs are inherently unreasonable? He listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing, and when she finally stammered to a halt, he was silent for a long moment, before responding with devastating courtesy. He understood, he said, that previous residents of Thornfield had been careless about maintaining property boundaries, but he had no intention of continuing such disorder. The stream was on his land, the land was his, and therefore the stream was his to control as he saw fit. However, he was not unreasonable. If she required water access, he would permit her to use the stream under specific conditions. She could access it each Monday and Thursday between the hours of 7 and 8 in the morning. She must use only the designated path. She must not linger beyond the time allotted, and she must acknowledge in writing that this was a privilege granted at his discretion, not a right she could claim. The terms were to be agreed to or declined in their entirety. He would not negotiate. Eleanor felt heat flood her face, recognizing the arrangement for what it was, a demonstration of power, a reminder of her dependence on his goodwill, a reduction of neighborly tradition to a contract that emphasized his authority and her subordinate position. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to find some other source of water no matter how inconvenient, to reject terms that treated her like a supplicant rather than a neighbor. But practicality warred with pride, and practicality, as it so often does, emerged victorious. She agreed, her voice barely above a whisper, and when he produced the document already prepared, he had known she would agree, had predicted her capitulation with the certainty of someone well-versed in calculating the breaking points of those with fewer resources and options. She signed it with a hand that trembled with something very like hatred. As she walked back to her cottage, the signed agreement in her pocket felt less like a contract and more like a surrender, the formal acknowledgement that between them, he held all the power and she held none. Summer arrived in Ashford Hollow with its usual abundance, painting the countryside in shades of green so vivid they seemed almost artificial, and Eleanor adjusted to the new rhythm imposed by the agreement. Monday and Thursday mornings found her walking the designated path to the stream, her movements careful and precise, determined to give the colonel no cause for complaint or withdrawal of the privilege he had granted. She never saw him during these excursions, but she felt observed nonetheless, as though the very trees and stones were reporting back on her compliance, and she hated the way this awareness made her conscious of her own body, her own movements, her own existence in space that was supposedly hers to occupy but felt increasingly like a stage where she performed acceptable behavior for an invisible audience. The village had taken note of the new arrangements, and opinions divided along predictable lines. Some thought the colonel entirely within his rights to manage his property as he saw fit. Others found his rigidity excessive and his treatment of Miss Hartwell unkind, though no one would have dreamed of confronting him directly about it. Eleanor became once again the subject of whispered conversations, though now they carried a different flavor, pity rather than dismissal. though she was not certain which was worse. The ladies of the charitable committee expressed their sympathy with meaningful looks and gentle pats on her arm, their kindness somehow making her feel more diminished rather than less, as though she had been officially designated as an object of compassion, someone to whom things happened rather than someone who made things happen. Colonel Ashworth, for his part, continued his rigid routines with machine-like consistency. His presence in the village marked more by absence than participation. He fulfilled all social obligations that could not be avoided with the minimum effort required, contributed to causes with mathematical precision, and maintained his property with the kind of relentless perfectionism that suggested a man at war with disorder itself. Eleanor, watching him during Sunday services from her usual pew 3 rows back, found herself wondering what had wounded him so deeply that he had constructed such formidable defenses, what he feared might happen if he allowed even the smallest breach in his carefully maintained control. But wondering cost nothing, and she indulged the curiosity she would never have dared voice, studying him the way one might study a locked door, trying to imagine what lay beyond without ever expecting to gain entry. The summer stretched on, each day bleeding into the next with the monotonous regularity that characterizes a life stripped of spontaneity or surprise, and Eleanor felt something inside herself beginning to calcify, to harden in response to the constant pressure of restraint. The agreement had become a symbol of something larger, of all the ways she had learned to make herself smaller, to accept less, to swallow her objections and adapt to circumstances rather than attempting to change them. She moved through her days with mechanical efficiency, tending her reduced garden, maintaining her cottage, fulfilling her charitable obligations, speaking when spoken to and never more than absolutely necessary. But beneath the placid surface something was fermenting, something that had been compressed for so long it had transformed into a substance both more volatile and more potent than its original form. It was in August, during the annual Harvest Festival, that the first true crack appeared in the architecture of their silent arrangement. Eleanor had contributed several of her roses to decorate the church, her blooms still magnificent despite the reduced space in which she could cultivate them, and she overheard 2 women discussing them within her hearing, not quite loudly enough to be intentional insult, but not quite quietly enough to be private conversation either. One commented that it was such a shame Miss Hartwell couldn't manage her garden properly anymore, while the other responded that perhaps it was for the best, as she had always been somewhat excessive in her cultivation. Rather grasping, really, trying to make her small plot seem more than it was. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of humiliation radiating outward, and Eleanor felt the old familiar heat of shame flooding through her body, the confirmation that she was still, would always be, the woman whose efforts were simultaneously too much and not enough, excessive and insufficient all at once. The judgment came not as a single pronouncement, but as a slow accumulation of small verdicts, delivered in glances and whispers, and the particular quality of silence that follows someone's entrance into a room. Eleanor had always known that the village observed her with a kind of bemused tolerance, but she had believed herself beneath the threshold of active criticism, too insignificant to warrant genuine disapproval. She discovered now that she had been wrong, that her very insignificance had rendered her an acceptable target, someone upon whom the village could project its anxieties and judgments without fear of consequence or retaliation. The narrative that emerged in whispered conversations and meaningful looks suggested that she had somehow brought the colonel's strictness upon herself through her previous presumption, that her years of using the stream had been an imposition she had been too socially oblivious to recognize, and that her current diminished circumstances represented a natural correction to the excessive liberties she had taken. Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife and the village's unofficial arbiter of social propriety, stopped her after services one Sunday with the kind of smile that preceded devastating observations delivered in the guise of helpful advice. She suggested with great delicacy and apparent concern that perhaps Eleanor might consider being more accommodating to Colonel Ashworth's requirements. That gentleman of his standing and experience deserved deference from those whose social position was more modest, and that a woman alone needed to be particularly careful about maintaining good relations with powerful neighbors. The words, couched in the language of practical wisdom, carried an unmistakable message. Eleanor's position was precarious, her security dependent on the colonel's continued tolerance, and she had best remember her place in the natural order of things. Others echoed similar sentiments with varying degrees of subtlety. The butcher who suggested she might find better prices if she were more pleasant in her dealings. The dressmaker who implied that custom depended on one's reputation for agreeability. The landlord who mentioned quite casually that cottage leases could always be reviewed if circumstances changed. Eleanor began to understand that she existed at the mercy of a collective will that could turn against her at any moment, that her quiet life had been permitted rather than guaranteed, and that she had somehow failed to recognize how tenuous her position had always been. The village that had seemed merely indifferent revealed itself as something more actively hostile, or perhaps it had always been hostile, and she had simply been too naive or too desperate to see it clearly. She found herself withdrawing even further, leaving her cottage only when absolutely necessary, taking circuitous routes to avoid encounters that might require conversation or explanation. Her garden suffered from her retreat, and she watched with dull acceptance as weeds gained territory and plants that required regular attention began to decline. What was the point, after all, of cultivating beauty that would only be criticized as excessive or destroyed by more powerful neighbors? What was the purpose of any effort when the results would inevitably be found wanting, judged insufficient by standards that seemed designed to ensure her failure? Have we not all experienced moments when the weight of others' expectations and judgments makes even the simplest acts feel impossible? When the safest course seems to be to simply stop trying altogether? Yet even in her deepest withdrawal, Eleanor could not entirely extinguish the small flame of anger that had begun to burn somewhere in her chest, a heat that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with a growing recognition of injustice. She had spent more than a decade accepting the village's assessment of her value, internalizing their judgment, believing that her humiliation had been deserved and her subsequent silence was wisdom. But watching the way condemnation flowed so easily toward her, while the colonel, whose actions were far more disruptive and unkind, received only respect and deference, she began to question the entire structure of assumptions she had accepted as truth. Perhaps a dangerous voice whispered in her mind during sleepless nights. Perhaps the problem had never been with her at all, but with a world that demanded women make themselves smaller and then punished them for the smallness it had required. Subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. These quiet revolutions need witnesses, and your presence here matters. September arrived with the first hints of autumn in the air, a crispness that spoke of ending and transition, and Eleanor felt something shifting within herself that corresponded to the changing season. The immediate catalyst was small, almost absurdly so. Colonel Ashworth had sent his gardener to trim the hedge that bordered their properties, and in the process, the man had cut down the single climbing rose that Eleanor had trained along her side of the boundary, the last survivor of her once abundant garden that had managed to escape the colonel's earlier destruction. She discovered the loss on a Thursday morning, returning from her permitted water access to find the rose reduced to a stump, its severed branches lying in a neat pile as though for her convenient disposal, and something inside her simply snapped. The anger that flooded through her was unlike anything she had experienced in more than a decade, white-hot and clarifying, burning away the layers of shame and fear and learned helplessness that had accumulated like sediment over the years. She stood staring at the destroyed rose, her hands clenched into fists, and felt 12 years of swallowed words rising in her throat like a tide that could no longer be contained. Every humiliation, every diminishment, every moment of silence when she should have spoken crashed over her in waves, and beneath it all was a question that demanded an answer. How much of herself was she willing to sacrifice for the appearance of propriety, for the maintenance of peace, for the comfort of people who would never extend the same consideration to her? She walked to Thornfield Manor without permitting herself time to reconsider, her fury propelling her forward before wisdom or fear could reassert control. The housekeeper, startled by Eleanor's unannounced appearance and the blazing determination in her usually docile expression, admitted her without the usual delays, and Eleanor found herself once again in the colonel's drawing room, though this time she did not sit meekly in the uncomfortable chair but stood in the center of the room, her spine rigid with righteous anger. When Colonel Ashworth appeared, his expression already forming into lines of cool inquiry, she did not wait for him to speak, did not give him the opportunity to establish the terms of their engagement as he had done before. She spoke, and the words came not with the hesitant uncertainty of her previous visit, but with the force of a dam breaking, releasing everything that had been held back for far too long. She told him that his destruction of her roses had been deliberate cruelty, disguised as property management, that his rigid control was not strength, but fear masquerading as authority, that his treatment of her had been bullying, plain and simple, and that she would no longer participate in arrangements that reduced her to a supplicant, begging for privileges on land where she had lived in peace long before his arrival. Her voice, unused to such volume or duration, cracked and wavered. But she pushed through, years of silence lending weight and power to each word. She informed him that she would use the stream when she needed water, not according to his arbitrary schedule, that she would plant her roses where she chose on her own property, and that if he found her presence or her boundaries inconvenient, he was welcome to construct whatever walls he required on his own land without destroying what belonged to her. The colonel stood perfectly still throughout her speech, his expression unreadable, and when she finally fell silent, not because she had finished, but because her voice literally gave out, leaving her throat raw and her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Eleanor felt the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation beginning to ebb, replaced by a creeping awareness of what she had just done, the bridges she had just burned, the consequences that would inevitably follow. But beneath the fear was something else, something unfamiliar and almost intoxicating, a sense of having reclaimed some essential part of herself that had been lost so long ago. She had almost forgotten it existed. Whatever happened next, she had spoken, had refused to disappear, had insisted on her right to occupy space in the world without apology or permission. And that fact alone felt like a kind of victory, even if it proved to be a Pyrrhic one. Colonel Ashworth moved then, walking slowly to the window that overlooked the boundary between their properties, his limp more pronounced than usual, as though the confrontation had somehow disrupted even his physical equilibrium. He stood with his back to Eleanor for what felt like an eternity, his shoulders rigid, one hand braced against the window frame, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality she had never heard from him before, something raw and undefended, as though her outburst had somehow breached his own carefully maintained walls. He told her without turning around that she was absolutely correct, that his behavior had been unconscionable, that he had treated her with a cruelty that was inexcusable regardless of his property rights or his authority. The admission emerged haltingly, each word seeming to cost him significant effort, and Eleanor found herself listening with an intensity that bordered on pain, scarcely daring to breathe, lest she interrupt this extraordinary moment of vulnerability from a man who had seemed constructed entirely of granite and iron. He turned then, and she saw in his face something she had not expected, not anger or indignation at her accusations, but a kind of weary recognition, as though she had named something he had been carrying, but could not or would not acknowledge until confronted with it directly. He spoke of the war, though not in the heroic terms men usually employed when referencing military service, but as a catalog of losses and failures and moments when control had been wrested entirely from his grasp. He had been a man accustomed to order and precision, he explained, and the chaos of combat had revealed to him just how little power he actually possessed over circumstances or outcomes, how fragile the structures of civilization were, how quickly everything could dissolve into blood and mud and meaningless death. When he returned to England, damaged in body and shattered in spirit, he had determined to impose order on whatever small corner of the world he could control, to create boundaries that would hold, to establish rules that could not be violated, to prevent through rigid discipline the kind of chaos that had nearly destroyed him. But in doing so, he acknowledged, he had become precisely the kind of tyrant he had once fought against, wielding his power over those with less, demanding submission in the name of order, justifying cruelty as necessary enforcement of boundaries. He had looked at Eleanor and seen not a neighbor deserving of courtesy, but a potential source of disorder that needed to be managed and contained, and in his zeal to maintain control, he had violated every principle of decency and kindness he had once believed himself to uphold. The recognition of what he had become was clearly causing him genuine anguish, his hands gripping the back of a chair with such force that his knuckles went white, and Eleanor found herself caught between vindication at having her grievances acknowledged and an unwelcome surge of compassion for this man whose defenses she had just systematically demolished. She spoke then, more softly, telling him that she understood something of fortresses built to protect wounded places, that she too had constructed walls around herself in response to trauma, that perhaps they were not so different after all. Two people who had learned to confuse isolation with safety, control with strength, silence with wisdom. She told him about her own humiliation, the pronouncement of dullness that had defined her adult life, the years of silence that had seemed like prudence, but had actually been a slow form of self-erasure. In speaking her own shame aloud, she felt its power diminishing, recognized that the only authority it had ever possessed was what she herself had granted it, that being deemed uninteresting by people whose opinions she had no reason to value was not actually a verdict on her worth, but simply a statement about their limited capacity to recognize value in forms that didn't match their narrow expectations. The conversation that followed was unlike any exchange either of them had experienced in years. Halting and awkward and painfully honest. Stripped of the social niceties that usually allowed people to maintain comfortable distances from one another's essential humanity. They spoke of loneliness and fear and the particular prison of reputation, of how much energy it required to maintain an image of invulnerability or acceptability, of the ways trauma could warp one's perception until defensive measures became indistinguishable from aggressive acts. As the afternoon light shifted and changed, painting the room in shades of amber and gold, Eleanor realized that she was seeing Colonel Ashworth clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an authoritarian neighbor or a symbol of oppressive power, but as a fellow human being struggling with his own demons, doing damage in the name of self-protection, just as she had done damage to herself in the name of avoiding further harm. And in that recognition, something fundamental shifted between them, a rebalancing of power that came not from one dominating the other, but from both choosing to lower their weapons and acknowledge their shared vulnerability. The change that followed was neither dramatic nor immediate, but rather gradual and organic, like the way winter surrenders to spring, not in a single moment of transformation, but through 1,000 small shifts accumulated over time. Colonel Ashworth had the fence removed and the gate taken down, restoring Eleanor's access to the stream without conditions or schedules. But more significantly, he began to appear during her morning visits, ostensibly walking his dog, but clearly present for conversation if she was willing to engage. Their exchanges began with awkward pleasantries and weather observations, the kind of superficial discourse that oils the gears of social interaction, but slowly deepened into discussions of books they had read, opinions on village affairs, memories of lives they had lived before arriving at their current isolated circumstances. Eleanor discovered that the colonel possessed a sharp wit and a surprisingly broad education, that his reading tastes ran to philosophy and history, that he had opinions on everything from agricultural reform to women's suffrage that were considerably more progressive than his autocratic behavior would have suggested. He in turn seemed genuinely interested in her observations, asking questions that suggested actual curiosity rather than polite form, challenging her ideas in ways that were stimulating rather than dismissive, treating her thoughts as valuable contributions to their discourse rather than evidence of intellectual inadequacy. It was, Eleanor realized with something like wonder, the first time in more than a decade that someone had engaged with her mind rather than simply tolerating her presence, and the experience was intoxicating in its simple acknowledgement of her personhood. The village noticed, of course. Nothing escaped the collective observation of Ashford Hollow, and opinions divided predictably between scandal and satisfaction. Some whispered that Miss Hartwell was setting her cap at the colonel in a most unseemly fashion, using proximity and persistence to entrap a gentleman whose social standing far exceeded her own. Others, more charitably inclined, suggested that two lonely people had found companionship, and there was no harm in it provided they maintained proper boundaries and didn't give cause for genuine scandal. Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife, watched their developing friendship with narrowed eyes and pursed lips. Her earlier advice about knowing one's place apparently forgotten or revised now that Eleanor seemed to have captured the colonel's attention through means she could not quite identify or condemn. But Eleanor, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, found that she cared remarkably little what the village thought or whispered or concluded about her actions. The woman who had once measured every word and gesture against the possibility of judgment had discovered that survival did not actually depend on universal approval. that being found wanting by people whose estimation she had no reason to value was not the catastrophe she had been taught to fear. She continued her friendship with the Colonel not because it was socially advantageous or strategically wise, but simply because she enjoyed his company, because their conversations challenged and stimulated her, because in his presence she felt less like a decorative object to be assessed and more like a fully realized human being with thoughts and feelings that mattered. The Colonel, too, seemed to be undergoing his own transformation, his rigid routines softening at the edges, his expressions of humor emerging more frequently, his participation in village life expanding beyond the bare minimum social obligation required. He joined the committee for parish improvements and actually contributed ideas rather than merely funding. He attended the harvest celebration and was observed actually smiling at the children's performance. And most remarkably, he was seen in conversation with various villagers, asking questions about their lives and concerns with what appeared to be genuine interest. The man who had arrived in Ashford Hollow like an invading force, demanding submission and control, was gradually revealing himself to be someone far more complex and human. And the village, despite its love of fixed categories and permanent judgments, had to adjust its assessment of him accordingly. How strange. How utterly strange that two people who had begun as adversaries could become the catalyst for each other's transformation. That conflict could be the doorway to connection rather than its antithesis. Spring returned to Ashford Hollow, as it always did, indifferent to human drama and transformation, painting the world in colors that seemed almost improbable in their vividness. Eleanor stood in her garden, which had over the winter months been restored and expanded. Roses once again climbing with abandon not just on her side of the boundary but on both sides, the Colonel having commissioned the planting of complementary varieties that would intertwine and bloom together, creating a cascade of color that belonged to neither property exclusively, but to both simultaneously. It was, she thought, an apt metaphor for what had developed between them, not a merging or a conquest, but an intertwining, two separate entities that remained distinct, yet created something beautiful through their connection. The Colonel had proposed 3 weeks earlier, not with grand romantic gestures or flowery declarations, but with characteristic directness, tempered by genuine emotion. He had told her that she had fundamentally altered his understanding of what strength meant, that her courage in confronting him had been the first honest thing anyone had offered him in years, that her willingness to be vulnerable while still maintaining her dignity had shown him a different way of being in the world than the rigid defensiveness he had cultivated. He loved her, he said, not in spite of her quietness, but because of the depth it concealed. Not because she had learned to speak, but because she had chosen to do so in service of truth, rather than merely to please or appease. Eleanor had accepted, though not without acknowledging the strangeness of their journey, that love should grow from conflict, that respect should emerge from confrontation, that two wounded people should find healing, not through being carefully gentle with each other, but through being honestly, unflinchingly real. She loved him, she realized, not because he had changed from tyrant to gentleman, though he had, but because in his presence she had discovered her own voice again, had learned that silence could be a choice rather than a sentence, that she could speak or not speak, based on her own assessment of what the moment required rather than fear of judgment. He had given her back something she thought she had lost forever, not by bestowing it upon her, but by creating conditions in which she could reclaim it for herself. The village had responded to the engagement announcement with a mixture of surprise, satisfaction, and in some quarters barely concealed envy. Barely. Mrs. Pemberton had offered congratulations with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, noting that it was remarkable how things worked out for those who were patient and strategic, a comment that revealed more about her own assumptions than about Eleanor's actual experience. But Eleanor found that the barbs that once would have wounded her now slid off harmlessly, rendered powerless by her own changed estimation of their worth. She was not the same woman who had spent 12 years in silence, and the opinions of people who had never bothered to truly see her could no longer define the boundaries of her existence. On the morning of their wedding, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her cottage one last time, pinning up her hair with the same precision she had always employed. But the woman looking back at her was transformed in ways that had nothing to do with bridal attire or temporary joy. She had learned that power could be challenged, that silence could be broken, that wounds could heal if one had the courage to stop protecting them and allow them exposure to light and air. The story the village would tell about her transformation would focus on the colonel, on how his arrival had changed her fortunes. But Eleanor knew the truth, that the real transformation had begun the moment she had chosen to speak, to refuse diminishment, to insist on her right to occupy space in the world without apology. Love had not saved her. She had saved herself, and in doing so had created the possibility for love between equals, for partnership built on mutual respect, rather than need or desperation. And that, she thought as she left the cottage for the church where the colonel waited, was a far better story than the one the village would tell. The true story of a woman who had found her voice and used it to remake her world, and in remaking it, had discovered that even the most wounded hearts could learn to love again, not despite their scars, but perhaps even because of them. Because scars are evidence that we survived, that we healed, that we refused to let our wounds write the final chapter of our story.